On a dim November evening in the year 1852, in a chamber heavy with incense and the low murmur of attending servants, a woman lay upon her bed of suffering. Her breath was shallow, her eyes fevered, and though her body was broken, her mind still wandered restlessly between numbers, dreams, and ghosts. This was Ada Lovelace, daughter of the poet whose verse set Europe aflame, and yet she was remembered not for words, but for the strange new language of machines. Outside her room, the streets whispered with rumor, with debts unpaid, with scandal untold. Inside, she clung to her final visions of what the human mind and the engines of iron might create together. Dearest listener, before we drift together into this long night's remembrance, I invite you to pause. Tell us, if you wish, in the quiet chamber of comments, where in the world you are listening. In this way, we form a circle that crosses oceans and years, and together we carry these stories forward. And if you find these recollections worth keeping, consider placing your hand upon the small emblem of subscription, that our path through time may continue. It begins not with a woman of renown, but with a child whose earliest memory was not of laughter, but of absence. Augusta Ada Byron was born in December of 1815, the only legitimate child of George Gordon, Lord Byron, whose poetry shook the foundations of Europe and whose personal scandals tore his family apart. Within weeks of her birth, the marriage collapsed. Her father, restless, untamed, fled England in disgrace, never to see his daughter again. She would not remember his face nor the timbre of his voice, save through the whispers of others and the ink of his lines. He died abroad when she was but 8 years old, leaving her only a silhouette, a myth, and a haunting inheritance of imagination. Her mother, Lady Annabella Milbanke, a woman of stern resolve and cold clarity, resolved to rescue the child from what she feared was a dangerous poetic contagion. For Annabella believed madness and verse ran together in Byron's blood, and so she sought to bind her daughter's restless mind with mathematics and reason, as one might attempt to tether a hawk with twine. Tutors were summoned, lessons planned, her days filled with the music of numbers rather than the rhythm of rhyme. Yet, can the blood of a poet be so easily denied? The little girl would grow with one foot in reason's garden, and the other always straying toward the thickets of vision. The early years of Ada's life were marked not by robust health, but by fragility. Illness visited her often, fever burned through her body, and her limbs weakened until walking became a trial. At one point, measles left her paralyzed for long months, confined to her bed. She gazed upon the world from windows and pillows, while her imagination soared beyond the walls her frailty imposed. Perhaps it was then that she began sketching her first great dream, the fantasy of flight. She studied the anatomy of birds, traced the angles of wings, and wrote in childish script of constructing a machine that might lift the human body into the air. She called this endeavor her flyology. One wonders, listening across the ages, whether in that fevered bed she already anticipated the mingling of life with mechanism, the promise of wings wrought not of feathers, but of calculation. It is said that in the long afternoons of her recovery, she was given books of geometry, of algebra, of astronomy. She held the compass in her hand, drew circles and lines, while the sunlight flickered upon the page. Her mother encouraged this discipline with an almost austere determination, fearing always that the poetic temperament of the Byrons would overwhelm the girl. And yet, though Ada delighted in the logical beauty of mathematics, she could not help but see in its structures a secret music. To her, numbers were not dry, but living entities. Equations whispered possibilities, and even the most rigid diagrams shimmered with imaginative light. She spoke of weaving patterns, of numbers as threads upon a loom. Was this her father's voice echoing in her mind or her own? No one can say. In her adolescence, she began to sense the burden of her name. At gatherings, there were always the half-curious glances, the murmurs about her father, the mixture of pity and fascination. Some saw her as the unfortunate daughter of a libertine poet, others as the promise of a new Byron, cleansed and reborn in the form of intellect rather than verse. Ada carried this weight with a peculiar mixture of pride and unease. She longed to be known for herself, not merely as Byron's daughter, and yet she, too, was drawn to the wild energy of imagination he embodied. There is a story told of Ada, around the age of 12, standing by candlelight in her chamber, carefully sketching the structure of wings she had designed. She dreamed of attaching them to her shoulders, of lifting herself upon the currents of the wind. Her drawings were precise, mathematical, yet her eyes gleamed with the vision of escape. She wrote of consulting the laws of gravity, of seeking the secret of motion, and even of considering the strength of materials for the frame. Here was not mere fancy, but the germ of an engineer's mind. And yet, what did she seek in those imagined wings? Was it freedom from her mother's stern lessons, from the stifling air of drawing rooms, or from the shadow of a father she never knew? Or was it simply the eternal longing of human beings to break the tether of earth? Thus the child grew, caught between frailty and brilliance, between absence and inheritance. Nights in the Byron household were quiet, her mother vigilant, tutors ever watchful, lessons strict. Yet in those nights, Ada's imagination took flight, fusing the lines of geometry with the whispers of dreams. The girl who could barely walk would one day walk boldly into the world of machines and ideas, though the road there would be filled with scandal and sorrow. And so, as the candle guttered upon the sketches of her flying machine, we glimpsed the earliest Ada, a child who lived as much in vision as in flesh, who breathed not only the air of her century, but of centuries yet to come. The wings she never built remained folded in her notebooks, and yet perhaps, in another way, they carried her forward into the strange destiny that awaited. The candle flame sputters. The pages lie open upon the desk, drawings of wings caught in the half-light. The night deepens, and we move with her into another chapter. The candle guttered, and upon the open pages lay the delicate lines of wings, faintly inked by a hand still unsteady from illness. From these sketches, we step into the long twilight of Ada's fragile youth, where sickness and imagination lived side by side, like companions both cruel and kind. She had known fevers that clutched her body for weeks, muscles that refused to serve her will, and long stretches of convalescence in quiet rooms where the ticking of the clock was often her only measure of time. Yet within this stillness her mind stirred with unending curiosity. The weakness of her body seemed only to sharpen her hunger for realms that transcended it. In those years, she watched the birds beyond her window with rapt attention. The flutter of a sparrow's wings became to her both a riddle and a promise. She noted how their flight was not the erratic dance it first seemed, but a rhythm governed by air and gravity. She dreamed of translating that rhythm into human craft. Thus she named her youthful endeavor Flyology, and it was no child's idle scribble. She wrote of the balance of forces, of the strength of materials, of the possibility of a frame fashioned to bear human weight. She even considered the power of steam to propel her design, though she knew little yet of engines. To most, she was a sickly child in her bed, but within her notes there breathed the beginnings of an engineer's inquiry. Her mother, vigilant and calculating, viewed these fancies with a wary eye. For Lady Annabella's fear, inherited from her bitter union with Byron, was always that her daughter might be consumed by the same wild imagination that had both exalted and destroyed her father. Thus she steered Ada constantly back toward mathematics and logic, demanding exercises in algebra, recitations of geometry, readings of astronomy. Reason, Annabella believed, would cage the unruly passions of the Byron bloodline. But Ada did not experience reason as a cage. To her, mathematics was not a mere restraint upon the poetic, but its secret ally. She spoke of numbers as though they possessed texture and sound, of equations as threads waiting to be woven. What her mother intended as medicine against imagination, Ada turned into imagination's sharpest tool. In her adolescence, she often walked with difficulty, supported by governess or maid, her step uncertain, but her gaze fixed far ahead. She would point to the sky and speak of machines yet unbuilt, of wings wrought by calculation. Those near her sometimes smiled indulgently, thinking it the folly of a convalescent child. Yet others, when they listened closely, sensed something strange in her intensity. This was not the idle fantasy of a child confined, but a restless conviction that human beings might surpass the limits of flesh. Even when illness confined her for weeks in darkened rooms, she wrote of the mathematics of motion, of balance and lift, as though she were already preparing to join some unseen race toward invention. It is tempting, in hindsight, to see in these early fascinations the foreshadowing of her later visions of machines of thought. Flight, after all, is not only a physical escape, but a metaphor for the mind's liberation. When she dreamt of attaching wings to her body, was she not also dreaming of attaching imagination to reason, of welding poetry and number into a single soaring craft? Perhaps her frailty, which forbade her body to run and leap as other children did, pushed her ever further into the boundless domains of the mind. The limitations of flesh became the provocations of spirit. Yet there was sorrow in her solitude, for though her mother guarded her closely, Ada often longed for tenderness more than discipline. The absence of her father was felt like a silence in the room, unspoken yet pressing. Byron's letters were never shared with her, his poems only cautiously revealed. But in moments of quiet, she would overhear the murmurs of servants or visitors, speaking of the poet's madness, his genius, his exile. These fragments wove themselves into her imagination, and she began to suspect that her own strange blend of passion and intellect was in some way his legacy. Did she ever imagine him looking upon her sketches of wings? Did she hope in some quiet chamber of her heart that the poet who had left her might be proud of the daughter who dared to fly? There were hours when the weakness of her body overwhelmed her, and she wept in frustration. The doctors prescribed tonics, poultices, endless rest. Her governess urged patience. But Ada's restlessness was never easily stilled. She wrote letters to her mother describing her progress in flyology, detailing the feathers she had studied, the angles of wings she had calculated. These letters were part scientific report, part plea for recognition. They reveal a young girl eager to be taken seriously, desperate that her visions not be dismissed as idle play. Even at 12, she demanded to be seen not as merely Byron's child, but as a mind in her own right. Outside, the world of England in the 1820s was stirring with the first rumblings of industrial transformation. Steam engines hissed, factories rose, trains were soon to knit towns together with iron threads. Though Ada could not yet know it, she was growing up in the dawn of an age that would both magnify and vindicate her dreams. To her, the hum of progress was still distant, but perhaps she sensed its approach. The same imagination that saw flight in the wing of a sparrow might also have glimpsed, in the smoke of locomotives, a future of machines far stranger still. As she grew into her teens, her health improved somewhat, though the shadow of weakness never left her. She began to appear more often at social gatherings, shy yet observant, marked always by the aura of her father's name. Her fascination with machines had not dimmed, but she learned to speak of it cautiously in the parlors of the well-born, where such subjects were often treated as oddities rather than serious pursuits for a young woman. Still, her eyes lit up when talk turned to science, to mathematics, to invention. She listened more than she spoke, But within her, the fire of curiosity only deepened. It is said that one evening after a long day of lessons, she sat again at her desk, the candle flickering low, the familiar sketches of wings spread before her. She dipped her pen and wrote not of feathers this time, but of engines, of power, of the possibility of steam-aiding flight. Her imagination had begun to shift, slowly, from the realm of birds to that of machines. The dream of flight was not abandoned, but it was evolving into something greater, something that pointed toward the very engines of thought she would one day envision. The candle burned lower. The pages of flyology lay waiting, ink still drying. A young girl's hopes pressed between lines of calculation and dream. The air was thick with the scent of wax and paper, the silence broken only by the scratch of her pen. Then the candle sputtered, as though marking an end to one chapter of her imagination and the beginning of another. The candle sputtered, and in the dimness the sound of her pen scratching upon paper lingered like a small creature, burrowing in silence. Those unfinished lines, caught between calculation and reverie, formed the threshold into her next years, where tutors and lessons shaped her days as firmly as any destiny. For Ada was no longer a child of fragile sketches, but a girl whose mind was beginning to weave threads of precision and poetry into something neither her mother nor her tutors quite recognized. Lady Annabella, determined to prevent the taint of Byron's instability, surrounded her daughter with figures of logic and control. Among them were the finest tutors that money and influence could secure. She studied under Augustus de Morgan, the first professor of mathematics at the newly founded University College London, a man whose writings and lectures would influence the very structure of mathematical education in England. Under his instruction, Ada was introduced not merely to the rote exercises of algebra, but to the larger philosophy of mathematics, its power to describe laws invisible yet immutable. De Morgan himself confessed amazement at the sharpness of her questions, the originality of her thought, even while warning that such intensity might strain a mind not fully trained. He seemed half in awe, half in dread of her boldness, for she asked not only how equations worked, but why they could not extend beyond numbers into realms unimagined. Here was the paradox that began to define her. Where others saw mathematics as cold discipline, Ada saw a living landscape. For her, a formula was not only a solution, but a symbol, a pathway into a deeper order. She would later write that numbers could be a new language of the unseen, capable of composing not only calculation but beauty, art, even music. Her mother, hearing such words, grew uneasy, fearing the Byron inheritance stirring beneath the numbers. Yet Ada could not suppress the impulse to find poetry in logic. When she drew circles in geometry, she saw not mere shapes, but harmonies. When she studied algebra, she felt it to be a loom upon which infinite patterns might be woven. There is an account of her describing mathematics as if it were a kind of enchantment. She wrote to De Morgan that she believed in the possibility of an all-embracing science that would connect quantities, shapes, sounds, even the feelings of the human soul. He replied with caution, praising her brilliance but urging restraint. Still, her letters reveal a hunger that exceeded the boundaries of textbooks. She was restless, impatient with narrow exercises, and constantly pressing toward the visionary. Yet her education was not all inspiration. The discipline was relentless. Hours bent over Euclid, evenings spent transcribing pages of algebra, mornings filled with astronomy and the properties of celestial bodies. Her mother watched closely, insisting upon rigorous study to curb the dangerous inheritance of Byron's imagination. There were moments when Ada rebelled quietly, retreating into her notebooks to scribble images of flight, machines, or half-poetic reflections. But mostly, she bore the weight of this training, her frail body forced into the rhythm of lessons, her mind turning ceaselessly even when her hands trembled from illness. At gatherings, in her mother's drawing rooms, she was occasionally invited to display her knowledge. Guests marveled at the girl who could recite principles of mathematics more fluently than most men of learning, yet many dismissed it as novelty, a parlor trick of the eccentric Byron child. Ada herself felt the sting of this dismissal. She longed not to be admired for precocity, but to be recognized as serious, as equal to the minds she studied under. This yearning would follow her into adulthood, sharpening both her ambition and her vulnerability to disappointment. As her studies deepened, Ada began to perceive a strange companionship between her father's absent voice and her present work. Though she had been shielded from much of his poetry, fragments reached her, and she felt the resonance. Byron's lines spoke of passion, chaos, and the tempest of the human heart. Her equations spoke of order, symmetry, and hidden structures, and yet she sensed they were not opposites, but reflections. Might not numbers also carry the music of the universe? Could not poetry be expressed in algebraic form? Was she not, in her own body, the meeting point of these two forces? Such reflections haunted her, lingering at the edges of her lessons. One evening she sat again with her candle, her books piled high, her eyes strained. She paused over a line of geometry and whispered aloud, as though to herself, that mathematics was the language through which God wrote the universe. These words were not hers alone, for others had said similar things, but in her mouth they carried a peculiar fervor, as though she believed she might one day decode that language not only for herself, but for generations yet unborn. She felt at once small and immense, a young woman in a strict household hemmed in by illness, yet also a vessel through which vast visions coursed. It is not easy to know how much of this intensity was visible to those around her. Her mother saw only the discipline, the achievements, the remarkable promise of a girl carefully guided away from madness. Her tutors glimpsed brilliance tinged with dangerous imagination, but inside Ada herself, the paradox deepened, and it would one day erupt in both triumph and scandal. For now, she was still the student, still the girl of fragile constitution, her candle guttering low as she wrestled with Euclid, her heart beating to rhythms neither her mother nor her tutors could fully understand. The flame, nearly extinguished, threw one last shadow across the pages of her notes. Circles and lines blurred together, and her eyes closed in exhaustion. In the silence that followed, the whisper of pages turning seemed almost like the breath of another presence in the room, as though her absent father's ghost lingered there, watching the daughter he never knew wrestle with visions he could not have imagined. And so, in that hush, the lesson books waited, Euclid's diagrams resting upon her desk, their precision frozen in ink, while her mind drifted toward sleep. Yet even in dreams, numbers might dance, and equations might sing. And in that blurred frontier between study and vision, Ada's story carried her forward once again. Her lesson books rested upon the desk, their diagrams silent, while her eyes, closed in exhaustion, dreamed unseen patterns. From that quiet chamber of youth, the story turns outward, into halls of music and laughter, into parlors lit with chandeliers and warmed with the murmur of gossip. For Ada was now of an age to be seen, and in the intricate dance of Victorian society, her lineage walked before her like a herald and a burden. To step into society as the daughter of Lord Byron was to enter a room already charged with whispers. Women leaned together to exchange fragments of scandal, men raised brows and smiled with a hint of knowing indulgence, and the girl herself, slender, pale, with eyes bright from fever and thought, bore it all with a composure learned from her mother's relentless tutelage. Annabella, ever vigilant, arranged her daughter's appearances carefully, as though polishing a gem that must shine but never dazzle too brightly. She dressed Ada in silks of muted tones, instructed her in manners precise enough to withstand scrutiny, and accompanied her with the gaze of authority that permitted no misstep. And yet, despite this shield of discipline, the air of Byron clung to Ada. There was in her bearing a mixture of reserve and intensity that set her apart from the other young women of her age. She spoke little, but when she did, it was often with a clarity and force that startled her listeners. In a room where the talk was of music, poetry, or fashion, she might suddenly draw upon astronomy or the principles of mechanics. Some found this charming in its eccentricity. Others found it unsettling. A young woman, they murmured, was not meant to discourse upon such matters with the gravity of a scholar. But Ada cared little for their murmurs. She had been raised to live beneath the weight of judgment, and society's disapproval was no heavier than the absence she had always borne. The rooms themselves, candle-lit and fragrant with perfume and tobacco, left an impression upon her mind that was both alluring and suffocating. She watched the couples dancing to the strains of violins, the sweep of gowns across polished floors, the glitter of jewels beneath gaslight. It was a world of surfaces, of carefully curated appearances, and yet within her there stirred always the hunger for substance. While others saw her as Byron's daughter, she thought of equations awaiting resolution, of patterns that stretched beyond the music into something deeper, something that seemed almost divine. Still, she could not wholly resist the spell of the gatherings. There was a thrill in being among people, in the eyes that turned toward her, in the sense of belonging, however tenuous, to a living world beyond her books. Yet society did not only observe her, it tested her. Questions came cloaked in politeness, designed to remind her of her father's infamy. And, "Do you write verses, Miss Byron?" some would ask, with smiles that bore both kindness and cruelty. Ada would answer with cool detachment, insisting that her interest lay in science, not poetry. Still, she felt the sting of their gaze, the unspoken expectation that she should either fulfill or disavow her father's legacy. It was a weight she carried silently, balancing the stern logic of her mother's lessons against the unquenchable spark of imagination that seemed to glow within her in spite of every attempt to tame it. It was at one of these gatherings, beneath the hum of conversation and the clink of glasses, that she first heard mention of a name that would change her life: Charles Babbage. He was already spoken of in certain circles as a brilliant, eccentric mathematician and inventor, a man obsessed with the possibility of mechanical calculation. To most, he was a curiosity. To Ada, the sound of his name stirred something deeper, as though destiny itself had brushed against her ear. She would not meet him yet, but his shadow had already entered her world. In those same years, she began to notice how society regarded her differently than it did her male counterparts. Young men could speak freely of science, could dabble in invention, could speculate without restraint. For Ada, every word was scrutinized, every display of intellect measured against the proprieties of her sex. She knew instinctively that she must tread carefully, lest her brilliance be dismissed as arrogance or madness. And yet she also knew that to suppress her hunger for knowledge would be a betrayal of herself. Thus she lived in constant tension, outwardly composed, inwardly aflame with thought. The music of society gatherings often lingered with her long after the candles had been extinguished. In her quiet chamber, she would recall the swell of violins and imagine it not as mere sound, but as the manifestation of patterns, frequencies, mathematical relationships. To her, music was not opposed to mathematics, but its sibling. Just as notes could be arranged to form harmony, numbers could be woven to form structures of beauty. This conviction grew in her, deepened, and began to shape her sense of destiny. She believed she might one day bridge the worlds of art and science, reason and imagination, in ways her mother had never dreamed and her father had never known. Still, the world she inhabited was not a welcoming one for such ambitions. The Victorian ideal for women was to be gentle, obedient, ornamental, a figure of grace rather than a voice of inquiry. Ada felt this cage tightening around her even as she tried to push its bars aside. She longed for conversation with minds that understood her hunger, but too often she found only polite dismissal. It was not until the doors opened to Babbage's salon, where philosophers, scientists, and inventors gathered, that she would taste the air of the world she truly belonged to. But that moment had not yet come. For now she remained the daughter of Lord Byron, watched, weighed, whispered about. In the hush of her chamber, after yet another evening of dance and laughter, she sat again before her books. The perfume of society still clung faintly to her gown, but the ink-stained fingers betrayed her truer self. She opened her notebooks and began to write, not verses, but figures and thoughts of machines that might someday think as men do. The candle flickered, and the murmur of distant music seemed to mingle with the sound of imagined gears turning in her mind. And as she wrote, she recalled the name she had heard whispered among the crowd, Babbage. It hovered in her thoughts like a key not yet turned in its lock. What machine did he build? What visions did he see? She could not yet know, but the curiosity stirred, and with it the faint sound of iron wheels turning far off in the night. The candle dimmed again, casting long shadows upon the desk, as though hinting at machines waiting in darkness, their gears unseen, their voices unheard, their destiny entwined with hers. The candle dimmed, and in its long shadow there seemed to stir the faint murmur of gears, as though some unseen machine turned in the silence. That whisper became, in time, the doorway through which Ada first beheld the strange contrivance that would forever entwine her name with the dawn of a new age. For it was in the year 1833, at a gathering not unlike the many salons she had endured, that she was led to the home of Charles Babbage, the man whose restless genius had already unsettled the polite order of science. Babbage's house was no ordinary residence. It was half parlor, half workshop, a place where the machinery of thought shared space with the rituals of society. Visitors found themselves surrounded by the peculiar presence of brass, of steel, of models and sketches scattered amidst books and instruments. Here stood the unfinished portion of his grand design, the difference engine, a machine of precision gears and levers meant to calculate tables of numbers with unerring accuracy. To some it appeared a curiosity, a grand toy of eccentric ambition. To Ada, it appeared like the skeleton of a living thing, a mechanical brain in its infancy. The moment she first gazed upon it, something quickened within her. Others admired the polished brass, the elegance of its construction, the novelty of the idea. Ada looked deeper. She saw not only the device before her, but the possibility beyond it. Her eyes followed the interlocking gears, the motion of levers, and in their arrangement she perceived a language waiting to be written, a potential unbound from mere arithmetic. She whispered to those near her that this was no mere calculator, but the embryo of a machine that might weave numbers as the jacquard loom wove threads. Babbage himself, hearing her words, turned toward her with astonishment. Few, if any, had glimpsed the full scope of his vision, and here was a young woman, barely past her teens, who seemed to divine it at once. From that evening, a peculiar companionship began. Babbage, a man already embittered by public failures, political battles, and the indifference of patrons, found in Ada a rare listener who not only grasped his schemes, but expanded them with imaginative clarity. She was not merely a pupil, she was an interpreter, a translator of mechanical vision into the poetry of possibility. In her notes, she described the difference engine as if it were alive, capable of thought, and destined to extend the reach of human reason. And yet, in this early encounter, the machine was unfinished, its promise unfulfilled. The government had grown weary of funding Babbage's endless demands for precision. The public scarcely understood its purpose, and the man himself raged against what he considered mediocrity surrounding him. To Ada, however, the machine's incompleteness was not a defect, but an invitation. Where others saw failure, she saw a horizon. It was as though the half-built device spoke to her directly, whispering of futures yet unseen, and calling her to become its voice. The atmosphere of Babbage's gatherings left a vivid impression upon her. There were philosophers, musicians, scientists, politicians, all conversing in the flicker of lamplight, their words weaving through the hum of curiosity. Ada, moving among them, felt at last that she had entered a space where her hunger for knowledge was not entirely out of place. She was still watched, still the daughter of Byron, still a curiosity in her own right. But here her thoughts found some echo, some recognition. The smell of oil and brass mingled with the fragrance of perfume, the sound of laughter with the metallic clink of gears being tested, and Ada felt herself suspended between two worlds, belonging fully to neither yet drawn powerfully to both. Her notebooks from these years are filled with fragments that reveal her excitement. She sketched diagrams, wrote reflections upon the symbolic nature of numbers, and speculated upon the uses of machines yet unbuilt. She spoke of poetical science, a phrase that seemed to embody her entire being, uniting her father's imagination with her mother's discipline, forging from them a vision uniquely her own. She wrote that the power of machines might not be limited to calculation, but could extend to music, to art, to the very expression of the human spirit. These were thoughts her contemporaries scarcely entertained, and yet she inscribed them with confidence, as though hearing already the faint pulse of a future age. Babbage himself admired her brilliance, though perhaps with the condescension of one who believed himself the greater mind. Yet he recognized her gift for explaining, for translating his abstruse concepts into forms that others might understand. In time, this gift would become her legacy, as her notes upon his analytical engine would far outshine the man's own descriptions. But in these early meetings, it was still only the stirring of friendship, the mingling of minds, the promise of collaboration yet to come. Society, of course, continued to gossip. Some admired the young woman who conversed so fluently with one of the great men of science. Others whispered disapproval, muttering that such pursuits were unseemly for a lady. Ada herself seemed unmoved by their chatter. She had tasted something rare, a glimpse of a world beyond the narrow expectations of her sex, and she would not willingly relinquish it. Yet she was also not free of society's chains. Marriage, duty, and reputation would soon press upon her, and the tension between her role as a countess and her hunger as a thinker would define her years to come. Still, the memory of that evening in Babbage's home never left her. The flicker of lamps upon brass gears, the sound of voices mingling with the faint click of machinery, the thrill of recognition in the eyes of the inventor when she spoke, these became for her a kind of initiation, a passage into a destiny she had not yet fully named. And so, when she returned home that night, the perfume of society still clinging to her gown, she opened her notebook once more. She dipped her pen in ink, and upon the page she wrote not of wings, as in her childhood, but of engines. The language shifted, the imagery evolved, yet the longing remained the same, a desire to join imagination with mechanism, to lift humanity by means of invention into realms unimagined. The candle upon her desk cast its shadow across the page, and in that shadow one might almost imagine the faint outline of gears turning, waiting for her hand to set them into motion. The candle burned low, the ink dried, and the whisper of brass lingered in the silence. As she laid down her pen, the night seemed filled with unseen machinery, vast and silent, waiting to awaken. The night seemed filled with unseen machinery, vast and silent, waiting to awaken. Yet when dawn came, it was not brass or steam that moved in Ada's life, but the slower, more inexorable motions of society's expectations. For she was no longer only the daughter of Byron, nor the prodigy who astonished scholars in Babbage's drawing room. She was also a woman of marriageable age, and in the intricate clockwork of Victorian propriety, her course was set toward the altar. In 1835, at 19 years of age, she was wed to William King, a man of standing, whose title would in time be raised, making Ada the Countess of Lovelace. To many it was a fitting match, she the brilliant and sometimes wayward child of scandalous lineage, he the steady figure of landed respectability. The union promised stability, legitimacy, and a respectable place in the circles of the aristocracy. Yet beneath the surface, the marriage was never only about titles or appearances. It became for Ada a new kind of tension, the life of gowns, estates, and children on one side, the life of mathematics, engines, and visions on the other. In the early days, she played the part society required. She dressed with elegance, greeted guests with composure, oversaw the duties of household and estate. The rooms of her new life were lined with heavy draperies, the air rich with the scent of polish and roses, the sound of carriage wheels arriving in the gravel drive. Her husband, by most accounts, admired her intellect, encouraged her pursuits within limits, and perhaps even felt pride in having a wife whose mind drew the notice of men like Babbage. Yet admiration and freedom are never the same. Ada knew the expectations that trailed her at every step, to be a wife, a mother, a lady whose wit amused but did not challenge, whose brilliance shimmered softly but did not flare. Her letters from these years reveal both affection and restlessness. She wrote of the joys of motherhood, of the birth of her children, of the warmth of domestic life. Yet intertwined with these lines are constant references to mathematics, to her longing to return to study, to immerse herself once more in the worlds of geometry and calculation. She spoke of feeling that her intellect might wither if confined solely to household duties. "I must have my mathematics," she confessed, as though numbers were not a discipline, but a sustenance without which she could not live. At times, she tried to merge the two worlds. She would sit in the nursery, her infant child near, while she sketched equations in her notebook, or she would walk the gardens of her estate, the evening air cool and fragrant, and imagine patterns of growth and proportion that seemed to her as mathematical as any theorem. But the balance was uneasy. There were days when the demands of society left her drained, when the endless expectations of rank and duty pressed heavily upon her, and she wrote of feeling as though a part of her were slowly suffocating beneath silks and obligations. Her husband, though indulgent, did not fully grasp the depth of her hunger. To him, her intellectual pursuits were admirable ornaments, enriching the reputation of the household, but he could not understand that for Ada, they were not ornaments at all, but the very axis of her being. And so she lived in a strange duality, countess in the eyes of the world, mathematician in the secret chambers of her mind. It was during these years that she returned more earnestly to correspondence with Babbage, seeking in him not only knowledge, but a companion of thought. She visited his workshops, questioned him about his engines, pressed him for details, and offered him insights. Her role as a wife and mother was never abandoned, but it was now interlaced with the life of ideas, as though two parallel worlds stretched side by side, touching but never wholly joined. At gatherings in her new role as countess, she continued to draw attention. The society ladies marveled at her conversation. The men were alternately charmed and unsettled by her fluency in scientific matters. To some, she was a wonder. To others, a scandal of intellect. and Ada, ever aware of the gaze upon her, both enjoyed and resented the role. She longed to be known not for novelty, but for substance. The air of drawing rooms, thick with perfume and idle talk, often seemed to her stifling, even as she navigated them with grace. She preferred the stillness of her study, where the only sound was the turning of pages and the scratching of her pen. But illness had not abandoned her. Even in marriage, she was frequently beset by weakness, by headaches, by the exhaustion that came from her fragile constitution. These ailments were both a burden and, paradoxically, a shield. They excused her absences from certain duties, gave her time in bed with books and papers, allowed her to retreat into the world of study under the guise of convalescence. Yet they also reminded her always of her own mortality, of the limits her body imposed upon the boundless ambitions of her mind. One evening she sat alone by a window in the Lovelace estate. Outside, the countryside stretched into darkness, the fields lying silent beneath the stars. She gazed upward and thought of astronomy, of the patterns of planets, of the invisible laws that bound them. In that moment she felt again the strange mingling of poetry and science, the voice of her father whispering in verse, the discipline of her mother binding her thoughts in reason, and her own spirit weaving them into visions of machines yet unborn. She wondered if her life would always be divided, wife and thinker, mother and visionary, countess and rebel. The window pane grew cold beneath her hand, and in its glass she saw not only her own reflection, but the faint shimmer of candlelight from the room behind her. The light flickered upon the walls, casting shapes that seemed almost like the outlines of gears, reminding her of Babbage's engines, unfinished, waiting. She turned from the window back to her desk, where papers lay scattered, some filled with household accounts, others with equations and reflections. Between them, she moved restlessly, torn between the immediate duties of her station and the eternal call of her mind. The candle flame trembled in the draught from the window, and in that trembling there seemed again the echo of a machine's whisper, patient, insistent, promising that her true work had not yet begun. The candle flame trembled in the draught from the window, quivering as though it were itself a small engine, consuming wax with a rhythm as steady as any cog. That fragile light became the portal through which Ada turned from the quiet rooms of her estate to the great labor that would bind her name forever with Babbage and with the dawn of mechanical thought. It began with a paper, a translation, and the notes she would append, which in time would eclipse the original work in brilliance and vision. In 1842, Babbage delivered a lecture in Turin upon his grander conception, not merely the difference engine of tables, but the Analytical Engine, a machine of far greater scope. In attendance was an Italian mathematician, Luigi Federico Menabrea, who published an account of the lecture in French. It was this account that Ada, at Babbage's urging, undertook to translate into English, yet she did not stop at translation. What she produced were her famous notes, a commentary longer and more profound than the original text itself, a document that breathed life into the cold description of machinery and revealed its potential as something more than mechanism, as the harbinger of a new form of reason. The labor consumed her months. By day, she attended to the roles of countess and mother. By night, she bent over her desk, pen scratching by candlelight. Her health was already faltering, and yet she pressed forward with a fervor that astonished even Babbage. In her letters, she confessed that she felt herself to be merely the vessel through which visions flowed, as though the engine itself whispered its secrets to her imagination. "That brain of mine," she wrote, "is something more than merely mortal, as time will show." She believed herself chosen, not by vanity but by conviction, to translate the language of numbers into prophecy. The notes spoke of the engine as more than a calculator. Where Menabrea described gears and processes, Ada described possibilities. She compared the engine to the jacquard loom, which wove patterns in silk by means of punched cards. If patterns of thread could be dictated by symbols, so too could patterns of number, patterns of logic. In this simple analogy, she grasped the essence of programmability, the principle upon which the future of computation would rest. And she went further. She speculated that the engine might, in time, compose music of complexity beyond human hand, for music was but the translation of number into sound. She envisioned it creating works of art, exploring realms of science, executing any process that could be reduced to rules and symbols. These were not fantasies, but rigorous extensions of logic, and yet they read with the breath of poetry. She wove together the imaginations of her father's blood and the mathematics of her mother's training, and in doing so, glimpsed a future her century could scarcely conceive. Babbage himself, though delighted, was also startled by the daring of her vision. He had conceived of the machine as a powerful calculator, a means of relieving human labor in producing tables and results. Ada saw it as something far more, not only a calculator, but a partner to the mind, a device that might extend imagination itself. In her notes, we hear for the first time the concept of the computer as more than arithmetic, as a general-purpose engine of thought. She had, in effect, written the first program, an algorithm for the machine to compute Bernoulli numbers, and with it the seed of all that would come centuries later. Her notes were published in 1843, signed modestly with the initials AAL, as though the world might not be ready to see the full name of Byron's daughter attached to such a vision. Few at the time paid much heed. The work was admired in some circles, dismissed in others, and soon fell into the quiet of archives. Ada herself received little recognition, her voice muffled by the indifference of her age. Yet the text remained, waiting silently until a future century would lift it from obscurity and recognize it as the prophecy it was. The process of writing the notes took its toll upon her body. Long hours, insufficient rest, and the constant drain of illness wore her thin, yet she could not stop. She confessed to friends that her mind burned with an intensity she could not quiet. "I am dogged by visions," she wrote, "that will not leave me." To others, she spoke of her work as poetical science, a phrase that baffled many, but which, to her, was the only way to describe the fusion of imagination and logic that animated her. At her desk, surrounded by papers littered with calculations, the candlelight quivering in the night air, she must have felt both triumph and despair. Triumph in that she had given shape to something vast, something that would outlast her own brief span. Despair in that her age scarcely cared, and her body threatened to betray her before her work was done. She oscillated between these states, carried forward by a force she could neither command nor escape. Outside, society continued its dance. Balls were held, carriages rolled, gossip flowed. Ada attended when required, adorned in silks, her eyes shadowed with fatigue, her mind wandering back always to the engine, to the paper, to the notes. To those around her, she may have seemed distracted, eccentric, perhaps even frail, but inwardly she felt herself engaged in a labor more enduring than any party or title. She was writing not only for her time, but for a future she could only dimly sense, a future where engines might hum with thought, and her words would be remembered as the first to articulate their promise. One evening, as she set down her pen after a particularly long stretch of work, she paused. The candle before her flickered low, nearly extinguished, and in the shifting shadows the diagrams of the engine seemed to move, the gears to turn, the cards to shuffle. She leaned back, exhausted, and wondered if the machine already lived in some unborn place, waiting to awaken. The room was silent save for the faint crackle of the wick, but in her mind there was music, a melody not yet written, spun from numbers into sound. The candle sputtered, and the ink dried upon the last page of her notes. The flame trembled, as if uncertain whether to endure or to die. In that trembling, one could almost hear the faint beat of the future, distant, insistent, unstoppable. The candle sputtered at the end of her notes, its light wavering as if undecided between endurance and extinction. And in that uncertain glow, Ada's words, freshly dried upon the page, seemed both triumphant and invisible. For though her vision had poured forth with a clarity her age could not match, the reception was muted, almost indifferent. A few voices praised the notes for their elegance, others acknowledged their breadth, but in the larger world of Victorian science they passed quietly, scarcely disturbing the air. And so she found herself in a strange position, at once admired and dismissed, noticed and neglected, both visible and unseen. When she entered the salons of London, her presence drew curiosity. Whispers preceded her. Byron's daughter, the one with a mind for mathematics, the woman who dared to write of engines. Some leaned forward eagerly, drawn by the novelty of a lady conversant in scientific matters. Others leaned away, suspicious, discomfited by the thought that she might trespass upon ground reserved for men. Ada felt these reactions keenly. Her sharp intelligence could dazzle in conversation, but she learned quickly that the very brilliance which set her apart also set her at odds with the expectations of her time. At gatherings where men spoke of philosophy, of politics, of invention, she would sometimes interject with observations both precise and daring. The room would pause, a silence falling just long enough to mark her words as extraordinary. Then the conversation would resume, often without acknowledgement, as if her contribution had been absorbed but not credited. There were occasions when the very ideas she had introduced were repeated later by men, met then with nods and approval. Ada, watching, felt the peculiar bitterness of one whose voice is heard but not recognized, whose presence is both essential and unacknowledged. Her letters from these years carry the weight of this frustration. She wrote of longing for a circle of true equals, of minds who would take her not as an ornament, not as a curiosity, but as a serious thinker. She confided that her notes had cost her dearly in strength and health, yet the world received them with a politeness that was almost more wounding than outright rejection. Better to have been denounced, she seemed to feel, than to have been faintly applauded and then forgotten. Still, she clung to the conviction that her work would one day matter, that time itself would prove her right. Society, meanwhile, continued its double gaze. To some she was a prodigy, to others an eccentric, to many merely a woman out of place. She played her part in drawing rooms, attended the dances, wore the gowns, smiled when required, but inwardly she carried the ache of invisibility. The perfume of such gatherings, heavy with roses and smoke, clung to her long after, and yet in her memory it mingled always with the scent of ink and wax from her desk, where her truer life continued in solitude. Babbage, for his part, admired her work deeply. He knew what she had accomplished, perhaps better than anyone, yet he, too, could not fully shield her from obscurity. His own reputation was embattled, his engines unfinished, his name as often mocked as lauded. In his letters to her, he alternated between encouragement and his own complaints of the world's blindness. Together, they formed a pair of voices crying out in a wilderness of indifference, bound by their shared vision, yet each bearing also the sting of neglect. Ada's mother, ever stern, regarded her daughter's pursuits with both pride and unease. She acknowledged the brilliance, but she feared the toll it exacted, both upon Ada's health and upon her reputation. Annabella had sought always to guard her child against the destructive fire of imagination, and now she watched with apprehension as Ada poured her vitality into work that seemed, to most of society, incomprehensible. She urged moderation, rest, caution. Ada listened, but she could not still the hunger that drove her. She felt as though she had glimpsed a horizon and could not turn her eyes away, even if the road toward it lay through solitude and exhaustion. In her solitude, she continued to write, to calculate, to imagine. She filled pages with speculations about the nature of mathematics as a universal language, about the possibilities of machines to transcend calculation, about the role of the human mind in shaping destiny. She spoke often of weaving numbers, weaving symbols, weaving the very fabric of thought. The loom and the engine, threads and gears, became her metaphors for the unity of imagination and logic. And though the world around her scarcely noticed, she felt herself engaged in a task that belonged not to her century, but to one, yet unborn. One evening, after returning from a particularly stifling gathering, she sat again at her desk. The laughter and chatter of the salon still echoed faintly in her mind, and she felt the sting of being simultaneously admired and ignored. She drew forth a half-written letter and let her pen wander across the page. "I am both a shadow and a flame," she wrote, "seen and unseen, burning and fading. Perhaps one day these contradictions will resolve, but for now I must live them." Her words capture the paradox of her life, a brilliance acknowledged only at the margins, a vision glimpsed but not embraced. The candle beside her flickered, its flame steadying after a moment of trembling, casting a circle of light upon the unfinished letter. The ink glistened, the page lay open, and Ada leaned back, weary, yet unyielding. Outside, the streets of London murmured with distant wheels and voices, indifferent to her presence. Inside, the silence of her study held her, both cradle and prison, as she continued to dream of engines that no one else could yet see. The flame grew taller for a moment, steady and bright, illuminating the unfinished letter, its edges curling slightly in the heat. The ink shimmered faintly, as though holding some secret yet unspoken, waiting for the hand to return. The ink shimmered faintly on the unfinished letter, its sheen like a pool of dark water, holding reflections unseen. And from that stillness, another current of Ada's life began to stir, not in the quiet clarity of mathematics, but in the restless gamble of chance. For as the years turned, whispers spread that Byron's daughter, the Countess who had written of engines, had also succumbed to pursuits less noble, pursuits where numbers were no longer symbols of harmony, but wagers of fortune. It began, perhaps, with her hunger for intensity. The same fire that had driven her to see machinery as a loom for thought also drew her toward the thrill of risk. She had always lived on the edge of paradox, frail in body, unbounded in mind, restrained by society yet yearning for freedom. And so it was not wholly surprising that she found in gambling a curious echo of her mathematical appetite. The calculation of odds, the tension of uncertainty, the swift revelation of chance, these became, for her, another kind of equation. Where others played blindly, she sought patterns. Where others guessed, she tried to calculate. Yet calculation, in this realm, was always shadowed by uncertainty, and chance does not yield as readily to reason as numbers written on a page. The salons of London whispered of her debts, of schemes in which she and a circle of companions attempted to exploit racing statistics, devising elaborate systems to predict outcomes and profit thereby. It was as though she sought to transform the unpredictability of horse races into the certainty of an equation, to tame chance as she had once sought to tame flight. But the horses ran their own courses, and chance is not so easily bound. Losses mounted, debts accumulated, and soon her name, already burdened by rumor, was further entangled in scandal. In her letters, one senses both exhilaration and despair. She wrote of sleepless nights filled with numbers that refused to align, of debts, pressing upon her, of a restless excitement that left her both alive and undone. "I cannot resist the charm of the calculation," she admitted, "though it drags me toward ruin." Was this not, in some twisted way, the same voice that once spoke of machines composing music? A conviction that numbers held hidden harmonies, that if only one calculated deeply enough, the pattern would reveal itself. But here, the harmonies were false, the patterns illusions, and the cost was not discovery but loss. Her companions in these ventures, some loyal, some self-serving, encouraged her, borrowed her schemes, shared in her failures. The debts grew heavy, forcing her into secrecy. She concealed them from her husband, from her mother, even from her closest allies. The strain of concealment weighed upon her as heavily as the debts themselves, drawing her into a labyrinth of anxiety. And yet, in moments of candor, she confessed that she felt almost powerless to withdraw, as though the same imagination that elevated her to visions of engines now compelled her toward the darker seductions of risk. Society, of course, relished the scandal. The image of Byron's daughter gambling recklessly at horse races was irresistible to those who had always suspected that her brilliance was only a mask for inherited wildness. Whispers spread in drawing rooms, newspapers hinted without naming, acquaintances smiled too knowingly. Ada, who had long struggled to be recognized as a serious thinker, now found herself reduced once more to a curiosity, a scandal, a warning. And yet, even as shame pressed upon her, she did not wholly repent. She continued to write of probabilities, of patterns, as though still convinced that within the chaos of wagers lay a deeper order waiting to be found. In her quieter hours, the toll was unmistakable. Her health, already fragile, suffered from the strain of secrecy, of debt, of sleepless calculation. She grew pale, her eyes shadowed, her body weakened. She confided in letters that she felt trapped, yet unable to cease. The engines of thought she had once imagined now seemed to turn against her, gears grinding not toward revelation but toward ruin. And still, in the solitude of her study, she wrote. Amidst the chaos of debts and gossip, she returned always to her notebooks, scribbling fragments of speculation, reflections on mathematics, on the potential of science, on the fate of her own mind. She seemed unable to separate the two currents of her life, the luminous vision and the destructive passion. Perhaps for her, they were not separate at all, but twin expressions of the same fire, one lifting her toward prophecy, the other pulling her toward collapse. One evening, as she sat surrounded by papers of both calculation and debt, the candle flickered and the shuffle of cards from another room seemed to echo in her mind. She imagined numbers dancing, not in harmony but in chaos, their patterns dissolving into chance. The whisper of gears she had once heard so clearly was drowned now by the shuffle, the clink of coins, the restless pulse of wagers. She set down her pen and closed her eyes, weary. The candlelight cast shadows across the table, long and uneven, like the uncertain paths of horses racing in the night. The ink upon her papers glistened, some pages filled with equations, others with notes of debts and sums owed. In the mingling of these pages lay the strange image of her life, genius and ruin, vision and scandal, inseparably intertwined. The flame quivered again, throwing the shadows into motion, as though the gears and the cards were both turning together, neither yielding, neither ceasing, both consuming. The flame quivered, and the mingling shadows of gears and cards seemed to shift upon the table, as if mocking her with their dual promises of reason and chance. From that trembling light, her body's old adversary returned with a persistence she could no longer ignore. Illness, which had haunted her since childhood, began again to carve its path through her strength. The fevers came first, accompanied by exhaustion that no sleep could mend. then bleeding, pain that tightened its grip, and a weariness that spread through every limb. The debts weighed upon her, the gossip corroded her reputation, but more insistent than these was the betrayal of her own flesh. In the earlier years, illness had been both obstacle and shield, confining her to her rooms but giving her the solitude to dream. Now, however, it became an enemy less merciful. Her body, weakened by years of strain, by sleepless nights over notes and wagers, by the relentless fervor of her mind, began to collapse beneath her. At first, she dismissed it, telling herself that she had endured frailty before and would endure it again. She tried to continue her studies, her calculations, her letters to Babbage. But her pen slipped from her fingers more often, her thoughts clouded in the haze of pain, and the pages remained unfinished. Doctors came, their prescriptions of tonics, morphine, laudanum, and rest, filling her chambers with the mingled scents of medicine and despair. They bled her, dosed her, argued over diagnoses, but little eased the progression. The pain grew sharper, the bleeding heavier. The certainty of her decline became clearer, even as no one spoke it plainly in her presence. She was in her mid-30s, still so young, yet she felt herself aged, worn, as though the candle of her life had burned too quickly, too fiercely, its wax nearly gone. In the midst of this suffering, she reflected often on whether her passions had hastened her decline. Was it the gambling, the endless strain of calculation, the anxieties of debt that had worn her body thin? Or had her health always been destined to falter, no matter how quietly she lived? She could not know. And so she lingered between guilt and resignation, wondering whether her brilliance had always carried within it the seeds of her undoing. There were days when she seemed to rage against her weakness, attempting to work still upon her mathematical speculations, demanding her papers, insisting upon conversation of engines and logic. Those around her urged rest, but she resisted, unwilling to surrender the one element of her life that still seemed to belong entirely to her. Yet there were also days of surrender when she lay back in her bed, her eyes half closed, whispering fragments of thoughts that drifted between clarity and dream. To her attendants, these murmurs seemed incoherent. To Ada, they were perhaps visions that pressed upon her mind even as her body ebbed away. Her correspondence dwindled, but in her last exchanges with Babbage, one can still hear the urgency of her spirit. She asked of him details of his work, encouraged him to continue, and confessed her fear that the world might never recognize the true potential of the engine. Babbage, though himself weary and embittered, responded with affection, assuring her of her unique brilliance. Yet both seemed to sense that the collaboration which had once promised so much was now drawing to its end. The machine remained unfinished, her notes unheeded, and her life slipping away. At times, she clung to religion, at others to philosophy, at others still to the restless calculation that had always sustained her. She prayed, she reasoned, she dreamed. She asked questions no one could answer. What is the soul's relationship to number? Does the language of mathematics continue beyond death? Can thought itself endure, woven into patterns unseen? These were not questions for doctors or priests, but for the silence of the night, for the flame of a candle that burned beside her bed. In the quieter hours when the pain subsided enough to allow reflection, she thought of her children, of the life she was leaving behind. She longed for them to remember her not as a figure of scandal, but as a mind who had sought to bridge two worlds, poetry and science, imagination and logic. Yet she feared, too, that they would inherit only the whispers, the debts, the tales of a woman who had lived too fiercely and died too soon. The rooms of her estate grew heavy with the scent of medicines, with the hushed voices of servants, with the cautious tread of doctors. Curtains were drawn against the harshness of daylight, and the chamber became a twilight realm. half-world, where time seemed suspended. The only constants were the beating of her pain and the flicker of candlelight. And one evening, as the candle once again sputtered beside her, she felt the strange intimacy of silence pressing close. Her papers lay scattered still, some with equations half completed, others with notes of debts, others with reflections of philosophy. The mingling of these pages was like a mirror of her life, vision and scandal, brilliance and ruin, bound together inseparably. She reached for a page, her hand trembling, but the strength failed her, and the paper slipped back to the table. The flame leaned sideways, nearly extinguished, then straightened, casting the room in uneven light. In its glow, shadows wavered across the walls, shifting like restless shapes, neither stable nor gone. Ada watched them through half-closed eyes, and perhaps in them she saw not shadows, but remnants of her visions. The outline of wings, the turn of gears, the shuffle of cards, all mingling together, unresolved. The flame trembled again, steady yet fragile, illuminating her pale face and the stillness of her papers. Outside, the night lay quiet, as though the world itself were pausing, waiting, uncertain. The flame trembled, lighting her scattered papers, each page a fragment of her life's contradictions, equations that reached for infinity beside notes of debts that dragged her down into the earthly mire. That same mingling of grandeur and ruin seeped outward into her relationships, for the secrecy of her financial troubles and the rumors of her reckless ventures began to erode the circle of trust around her. Friends who once drew close now kept their distance, whether from disappointment, disapproval, or fear of being entangled in her troubles. The silence of such withdrawal pressed upon her like a second illness, one that gnawed not at the body but at the spirit. She had concealed much. Her gambling debts were not modest trifles, but vast and pressing, sums that would alarm even those of great means. She had sought to mask them through schemes, through appeals to allies, through the promise of winnings yet to come. At times she turned to her companions with a desperate brilliance, weaving calculations into persuasive arguments, convinced that one more attempt, one more wager might rescue her from the precipice. But the precipice only widened, and each promise became another weight of secrecy upon her shoulders. In society, whispers traveled more swiftly than truth. There were rumors of affairs, of reckless indulgence, of improprieties that blurred the line between scandal and invention. Some exaggerated, some invented, but Ada knew too well that she had given cause for gossip. Her presence at races, her association with questionable companions, her reputation for intellect turned to calculation. All these fed the mouths of those eager to see Byron's daughter repeat the infamy of her father, and so she found herself once more a paradox, celebrated in private for her brilliance, scorned in public for her excesses, admired by a few, pitied or judged by many. The secrecy grew unbearable. She confessed parts of her troubles to certain confidants, pleading for assistance, and at times she was met with compassion. Yet even compassion carried its cost, for every hand extended in help reminded her of her own vulnerability. She, who had once written of engines that might transcend human limitation, now found herself humbled by the most ordinary of chains, unpaid debts, unspoken confessions, unkind whispers. Her husband, William, remained by her, yet even he was not fully aware of the depths of her entanglement. Ada shielded him, whether from pride or fear, and in doing so drew herself deeper into solitude. The very brilliance that once won her admiration seemed now to isolate her, for few could comprehend how the woman who envisioned machines of thought could also be ensnared in such reckless wagers. But perhaps the two were not opposites. Perhaps both sprang from the same restless spirit, the same hunger for pattern, for mastery, for glimpsing order in what others called chaos. Illness worsened this solitude. As her health declined, visits became rarer, her circle narrower. Those who might once have spoken with her of mathematics or music withdrew, leaving her to the company of physicians and a few loyal attendants. The air of her chamber thickened with both medicine and loneliness. She wrote fewer letters, not only because her strength faltered, but because her confidences had betrayed her before. What had once been her refuge, the act of setting thought to paper, became fraught with the fear of exposure. Yet in her isolation, her mind did not cease. She reflected often upon the contradictions of her life. Had she been reckless, or had she merely lived more intensely than her world could permit? Was her downfall the result of folly, or of daring to seek patterns in places where none could be fixed? She questioned whether the very traits that had given her vision, imagination, audacity, passion, had also driven her toward ruin. And in this questioning there was no resolution, only the quiet recognition that light and shadow had been bound together in her from the first. One evening, as the candle guttered beside her, she thought again of her father. Byron, who had fled from scandal, who had burned brightly and died young, leaving behind both poetry and ruin. Ada, in her different way, had lived the same paradox. She, too, was brilliant, reckless, consumed by visions, undone by excess. She wondered whether this was fate, whether the inheritance of his blood had always carried her here, no matter how carefully her mother had sought to bind her to reason. Perhaps she was destined to fulfill not her mother's plan of sobriety, but her father's legacy of brilliance and tragedy combined. Her chamber grew stiller as her illness advanced, the hours marked not by conversation, but by the creak of the floorboards, the faint ticking of the clock, the occasional whisper of servants outside her door. Friends who had once written fell silent, or their letters grew formal, perfunctory. Even Babbage, though faithful in admiration, was increasingly distant in presence, absorbed in his own battles. Ada felt the encroachment of abandonment, not deliberate but inevitable, as though the world were quietly stepping back from one already marked by death. And yet, in that silence, she continued to hold fast to her visions. She thought still of the Analytical Engine, of its unbuilt form, of the notes she had left behind. She wondered whether they would be lost like so many unfinished works, or whether some future age would find in them the seeds of a new language. She felt the sorrow of knowing she would not see that age, yet also the faint comfort of believing she had sown something that might outlast her. The candle burned lower, its flame bent by the faintest draught. The shadows lengthened on the walls of her chamber, stretching like silent figures retreating into darkness. The papers on her desk lay undisturbed, sealed by her frailty and by the secrecy she could not break. Their ink seemed to darken in the failing light, as though absorbing the silence around them. And in that mingling of silence, secrecy, and shadow, Ada's world seemed to narrow further, like a corridor drawing toward its end. The corridor narrowed with secrecy and shadow, and at the end of it stood not only illness and debt, but the fading outlines of her great collaboration. For the silence that grew around Ada was mirrored, too, in her relationship with Babbage. Once their correspondence had been charged with shared discovery, their voices meeting like two lanterns in the fog, each illuminating the other. Now the lanterns seemed to drift apart, their light dimmed by distance, misunderstanding, and the inexorable weariness of lives marked by disappointment. Babbage himself was embattled. His difference engine remained unfinished, the Analytical Engine a dream upon pages and models, its vast potential doubted by patrons and ignored by politicians. His reputation had soured. Many who once praised him now saw only a querulous eccentric, demanding funds without delivering results. He raged against the incompetence of manufacturers, the indifference of government, the mediocrity of his age. To Ada, who once heard in his voice the thrilling promise of the future, his words now carried the bitterness of defeat. She admired him still, Yet she sensed that his vision had grown narrower, his energies consumed by quarrels rather than invention. In their letters during these later years, a subtle strain can be felt. Babbage remained grateful for her notes, yet perhaps resented that her interpretations had in some ways eclipsed his own. Ada, for her part, still sought his counsel, still pressed him with questions, but her tone carried an urgency he could not always meet. Where she longed for speculation upon the vast philosophical implications of the engine, he returned to the details of construction, the complaints of funding, the frustrations of politics. It was as though they were now speaking across a widening gulf, she of visions, he of grievances, both still connected, yet no longer in perfect sympathy. And yet, even as the relationship cooled, the memory of their early collaboration remained a source of strength for her. She returned often to her notes, rereading them, perhaps revising them, perhaps only lingering upon the words as one lingers upon relics of a past both triumphant and irretrievable. She knew the world had not recognized them, but she clung to the belief that they mattered, that time itself would one day vindicate her labor. Still, the ache of neglect pressed upon her. To have glimpsed so much, and to die before seeing it realized. This was a sorrow deeper than scandal or debt. At times, she allowed herself to imagine the engine as if it had been built. She pictured the great frame of iron and brass, the wheels turning, the cards feeding through, the clatter of calculation echoing like music. She imagined standing before it, hearing not only numbers but symphonies, not only equations but harmonies of thought. And in those imaginings, she felt a bittersweet blend of triumph and despair. Triumph in that she had seen what others could not. Despair in that she would never see it brought to life. Her health, ever fragile, continued to erode. Pain consumed her days, bleeding weakened her, morphine dulled her senses, yet her mind still sparked with questions. She wrote less often, but when she did, her words carried an almost prophetic tone, as though she were already half-turned toward the future, speaking not to her contemporaries, but to generations yet unborn. "The analytical engine," she wrote, "weaves algebraic patterns as the jacquard loom weaves flowers and leaves." These words, unnoticed then, would echo more loudly in centuries to come than in her own time. But in her own time, the silence grew heavier. Society, which had once gossiped about her brilliance and her scandals, now gossiped less. Illness made her absent from gatherings. Debts made her unwelcome in some circles, and her name slipped from lips that once spoke it with curiosity. Even her mother, vigilant always, drew closer in control yet further in sympathy, treating Ada less as a companion and more as a patient to be managed. It was a lonely narrowing, a closing in of corridors in which the only true companions were pain, memory, and the flicker of vision that refused to leave her. And in that solitude, the dream of the analytical engine itself seemed to fade, like the outline of a great machine glimpsed at twilight, its details dissolving into dusk. Ada clung to it still, but it was now more memory than hope, more relic than promise. She had once imagined herself its prophetess, its interpreter, its voice to the world. Now she felt herself its mourner, keeping vigil over a vision that the world seemed content to abandon. One evening, as she lay weak upon her bed, her papers scattered around her, she asked that her attendants bring her the old diagrams of the engine. They spread them upon a table near her, and she gazed upon them silently, too weak to write, but unwilling to let them be taken away. The flicker of the candle made the gears upon the page seem to shift, as though the machine itself breathed faintly in the shadows. She reached out her hand but could not touch. The vision hovered just beyond reach, as it had all her life. The candle flame bent in the draught, trembling, and the shadows of the drawn gears lengthened across the wall. They loomed like specters, vast and silent, reminding her that some dreams, however clearly glimpsed, remain forever unbuilt. The shadows of the drawn gears lengthened across the wall, wavering like immense, half-seen figures that lived only in the trembling of the candlelight. Ada, gazing at them with eyes weary from illness, yet still restless with thought, allowed her mind to wander into that space where numbers and imagination met. If the engine could weave algebraic patterns as surely as the jacquard loom wove flowers, then why should its scope end at calculation? Why should it not extend itself into realms where numbers became not only symbols of reason, but the very material of beauty? Thus she turned her reflections toward music, toward art, toward the idea that a machine might one day compose what once belonged solely to the human spirit. For to Ada, music was already a mathematical form. She had studied the ratios of tones, the structures of harmony, the way vibrations formed patterns of sound. If one could express those patterns in numbers, and if an engine could follow the rules of numbers, then surely, in principle, it might one day create a melody no less intricate than the hand of a composer. She spoke of this possibility in her notes, speculating that the analytical engine could compose elaborate and scientific pieces of music of any degree of complexity or extent. Few of her contemporaries could follow her reasoning, and many dismissed it as fanciful. Yet to her it was no fantasy, but the natural extension of logic into imagination. Her vision did not end with music. She imagined that the engine might one day extend into the creation of art, into the modeling of processes, into the simulation of phenomena that no human hand could grasp in detail. She wrote of science, of philosophy, of the very laws of nature being translated into the language of machinery. To her, mathematics was not confined to numbers upon a page. It was the fabric of reality itself, and the engine was the loom upon which that fabric might be woven anew. In this, she glimpsed the future of computation, not as a servant of arithmetic, but as a partner of thought. And yet her words were met mostly with silence. Some who read them admired her boldness, but few could imagine a machine that did more than calculate sums. To them, her vision seemed excessive, even eccentric, the musings of a woman who mingled imagination with science too freely. Perhaps it was precisely because she mingled them that she saw further than they, the very mixture that others distrusted, the inheritance of Byron's poetic fire fused with Annabella's mathematical rigor, gave her the power to perceive what others could not. But this same mixture also ensured that she would not be understood, not in her time. In her chamber, the shadows of gears upon the wall seemed to shift into the forms of harps and violins, as though the machinery of thought and the instruments of music were but reflections of one another. Ada listened inwardly, hearing melodies that no composer had written, patterns unfolding as though some unseen engine were already playing within her mind. Whether these were visions born of genius or hallucinations kindled by illness and morphine, none could say. To her, they were real enough, and they comforted her in the long hours of solitude. The thought that machines might one day create beauty unsettled even her. Would such beauty be real, or would it be only an imitation? Could a machine feel the sorrow of a chord, the joy of a rising melody, the anguish of dissonance resolving into harmony? Or would it merely reproduce patterns without soul? She did not answer these questions. She left them open, as riddles for the future. Perhaps even now they remain unanswered. For who can say whether the creations of engines are less or more than imitations of spirit? These speculations brought her again to the thought of human imagination itself. Was imagination merely the highest form of calculation, an arrangement of symbols too complex to be seen for what it was? Or was there, in the human heart, something no machine could ever touch? Ada lingered upon this question, not with the cold detachment of a philosopher, but with the tenderness of one whose own imagination had both exalted and destroyed her. If the mind was only a pattern, then perhaps her visions could outlast her in machinery. But if the mind was something more, poetry, soul, flame, then perhaps her dreams would die with her. The pain in her body grew sharper, yet in the intervals between its waves, her thoughts roamed far. She spoke at times to her attendants of music, of patterns, of the strange possibility that engines might one day converse with human minds as instruments converse with musicians. They listened with polite incomprehension, nodding, soothing her with words of comfort, not realizing that her fragmented whispers contained glimpses of a century not yet born. Her mother, hearing these murmurs, grew troubled. To Annabella, such speculations seemed dangerous, too close to the madness she had always feared in Byron's blood. She urged Ada to focus on prayer, on scripture, on preparing her soul for death. Ada obeyed in part, for she was not without faith, but she could not wholly silence the fire of her thoughts. Even as she prayed, visions of engines and music intermingled with her words, as though her mind refused to be bound by a single devotion. The candle burned lower, and the shadows of gears upon the wall blurred into indistinct forms. Yet from the corner of the room came a faint sound, or perhaps only the echo of her imagination, a single note, like the pluck of a harp string, reverberating through the silence. Ada turned her head toward it, eyes half closed, lips parted in the ghost of a smile. Whether she truly heard or only dreamed, it mattered little, for in that moment the boundary between machine and music, number and beauty, seemed to dissolve. The flame leaned, almost extinguished, and the note, real or imagined, lingered in the air like a thread of sound stretched too fine to endure. The note lingered in the silence, thin and trembling, stretched almost beyond hearing, and from it the room seemed to thicken with the presence of her illness. The imagined harp string faded, but in its place came the groans of her body, the whispered conferences of physicians, and the heavy scent of medicines that filled the chamber like an invisible fog. Laudanum, morphine, tinctures of opium, powders of chalk, poultices of herbs, all these were administered with solemn authority, and yet the pain continued, steady and unrelenting. Lavender was burned to soothe her, and for a moment its fragrance softened the air, but soon it mingled with the bitter edge of laudanum until the very atmosphere of her room was steeped in contradiction, sweet and acrid, comfort and torment entwined. Doctors came and went, their boots clicking softly on the floorboards, their consultations hushed, their prescriptions delivered with grave confidence. They bled her when she was already weak. They spoke of balance of humors when her body cried for relief, and when the pain grew too strong, they dosed her with morphine until the edges of her thoughts blurred. In those blurred states, she drifted between clarity and dream, half in this world, half in another. At times, she roused with sudden brilliance, speaking of numbers and patterns, startling those around her with the sharpness of her vision. At other times, she murmured incoherently, her words dissolving into fragments of poetry, memory, and hallucination. The illness, which had shadowed her since childhood, now revealed its final cruelty. It was uterine cancer, though the doctors of her age did not name it thus with certainty. The pain in her abdomen grew constant, the bleeding more severe, her strength diminishing daily. Every movement became an effort, every breath a reminder of her body's betrayal. And yet, within her, the mind continued to race, as though the very imminence of death urged her thoughts into greater speed. She lay in bed, eyes half closed, speaking to herself of engines, of music, of the weaving of symbols, even as her attendants dabbed her brow with cloths soaked in lavender water. There was something haunting in the juxtaposition. The Countess's chamber, once a place of calculation and study, was now filled with whispers of doctors, with the clink of glass vials, with the steady drip of remedies poured and swallowed. Her notebooks lay unused upon a nearby table, pages yellowing, ink fading, as though abandoned. Yet within her imagination they lived still, alive with patterns she could not write, but only whisper. To those who listened, her murmurs seemed the delirium of a dying woman. To Ada, they were visions as real as any she had ever known, glimpses of a world her body would not survive to see. Her mother grew more vigilant in these days, seated often by her bedside, stern even in her care. Annabella urged her daughter to set aside visions of engines, to prepare her soul with scripture and confession. She summoned ministers, read aloud from the Bible, prayed over her. Ada weakened, acquiesced at times, listening to the cadence of psalms, yet always her mind returned to its own patterns. She would close her eyes and see not only verses, but equations shimmering behind them, as though faith and calculation had merged into a single tapestry. Perhaps in those hours she no longer distinguished between them, for to her both spoke of order, of hidden laws, of a structure binding the universe. The days passed in a rhythm of pain and sedation, of wakefulness and drifting dream. Sometimes she lay still, her lips moving in silent calculation, her hands twitching as though to grasp an absent pen. At other times she smiled faintly, as if seeing something invisible to all others in the room. Those attending her could not tell whether she smiled at memory, at hallucination, or at some vision that pressed upon her from a horizon beyond life. Outside her chamber, the world continued indifferent. Carriages rattled along London streets, society danced and whispered, Babbage raged against ministers, and newspapers carried their endless tide of news. But within that room, time seemed to collapse into stillness. The only measures were the tolling of pain, the flicker of candlelight, and the faint murmurs of a woman caught between numbers and eternity. One evening, as the morphine dulled her body into stillness, Ada whispered of music again. She told her attendant that she could hear an unseen instrument, playing chords that rose and fell like breath. The attendant, thinking her feverish, soothed her gently, but Ada continued, describing how the chords were built from ratios, from numbers, from patterns too vast to be heard by mortal ears. Her words trailed off into silence, yet in her eyes there flickered a strange light, as though she truly heard what she described. The lavender burned low in its dish, releasing one last breath of fragrance before extinguishing. The candle flame shivered in the draught, casting the room into an uneasy mixture of shadow and glow. Ada lay with her head turned slightly, her hair damp from sweat, her breath shallow. Her eyes fixed upon a place beyond the ceiling, as though watching something invisible pass across it. The attendants watched her, uncertain whether she spoke in dream or in vision. She whispered again, so faintly they leaned close to hear. "Patterns," she said, "everywhere patterns." Her voice was a thread, almost lost, but the words lingered in the room like the faintest of echoes. The candle bent lower, its wax nearly gone, and the shadows of the chamber lengthened into forms that wavered like apparitions, neither fully present nor entirely absent. The faint trace of lavender clung still in the air, mingling with the acrid bitterness of laudanum, and in that mingling of scents, in that trembling of flame, Ada drifted once more between clarity and dream, her body failing, her mind still weaving. The flame trembled low, the mingled scents of lavender and laudanum drifting in the air, and into that haze came one of the few respites she was granted in those final months. For as her body waned and her thoughts wavered between clarity and dream, there were moments of unexpected peace when memory softened the edges of pain, and her mind turned, as if by its own design, toward the figure she had never known yet always carried, her father, Lord Byron. He had been gone before she could remember, exiled by scandal, dead in a foreign land when she was but a child. And yet his presence had been a constant absence, a silence heavy as stone. Her mother had spoken of him with measured caution, never with warmth, presenting him as both warning and shadow. But to Ada, the fragments that reached her, scraps of verse, anecdotes murmured in drawing rooms, the sharp lines of his portrait, grew into a figure both mythic and intimate. He was the flame that had consumed itself too quickly, the poet who had given her life yet left her none of his tenderness. In her weakened state, she found herself reaching for him more than she ever had before. She whispered of him to her attendants, sometimes in reproach, sometimes in longing. She asked to hear his verses read aloud, and when they did, the cadences seemed to stir something deep within her. His words of tempest and passion, of longing and ruin, resonated with her own life, though she had sought always to define herself against him. She had lived in mathematics where he had lived in poetry, in calculation where he had dwelled in desire. And yet here, at the edge of death, she felt the truth of what she had always known, that they were bound, that her visions and her excesses were in some measure his legacy, carried in her blood. She spoke once, haltingly, of a dream she had as the laudanum carried her into half-sleep. She saw herself walking upon a shore at dusk, the sea stretching out infinite, the waves silver in the failing light. A figure walked beside her, tall, cloaked, with features she could not fully see, yet she knew, with the certainty of dream, that it was her father. They did not speak, but walked together in silence, their footsteps mingling in the sand. She woke with tears upon her cheeks, murmuring that for the first time she had felt him near. To her mother, such confessions were troubling. Annabella feared that in seeking Byron, Ada sought the very madness she had tried so long to prevent. But Ada, though respectful, was unshaken. She told her mother that she wished to be buried beside him, in Hucknall, as though at last, in death, the two might be reconciled. Annabella protested at first, but Ada persisted, her voice steady even when her body trembled. For her, it was not a gesture of rebellion, but of completion. She had lived always as the meeting of two forces, her father's imagination and her mother's discipline. To be laid beside him was to acknowledge that she could never escape that inheritance, nor did she wish to. Her attendants noticed a change in her during these moments of reflection. The fever lines softened upon her face, her breathing eased, her eyes took on a gentler light. It was as if turning toward her father gave her a kind of peace she had long denied herself. She spoke less of debts, less of scandal, less even of engines. She spoke instead of poetry, of legacy, of the strange ties that bind the living to the dead. She asked once whether, in some distant realm, he knew of her, whether he saw her visions, whether he was proud. No one answered, for no one could. But the question itself hung in the air like an offering, delicate and unresolved. At times she recited fragments of his verse from memory, her voice thin but steady. "She walks in beauty," she murmured, smiling faintly, though the beauty she imagined was not herself, but some figure luminous in her mind. The words, though once forbidden to her, now came easily, as though she had carried them all along. And in speaking them, she felt not only her father's presence, but also her own reconciliation with the part of herself that had always longed for poetry, even while clothed in numbers. Her chamber, once filled with the harsh smells of medicine, seemed softened during these hours by the gentler presence of memory. The candlelight flickered upon the walls, casting shadows that no longer loomed like engines or debts, but like figures walking together, indistinct yet companionable. Ada lay back, her breath shallow but calm, and the faintest smile touched her lips. She whispered that she no longer feared the shadows, for they carried her father's voice within them. One evening, she asked for her children to be brought to her bedside. She spoke to them of their grandfather, not in the tones of reproach her mother had used, but with tenderness, as though to gift them with a lineage of both caution and wonder. She told them that within their veins ran the same fire, and that they must guard it and cherish it in equal measure. Her words were halting, but the children listened, wide-eyed, as though receiving a story from some distant mythic past. As the night deepened, the candle flame grew low, and Ada's voice faded into silence. Her eyes closed, but her lips still moved faintly, as if speaking to someone unseen. Perhaps she conversed with her father. Perhaps she whispered only to herself. The attendants could not tell, nor did they disturb her. For in that moment the room seemed filled with a presence that none could name, a peace that descended like a veil. The candle, struggling against its final wax, bent forward, and the shadow of its flame fell across her face, softening her features into stillness. The silence was deep, broken only by her uneven breath, but within it lingered the faint echo of Byron's lines, carried not by voice but by memory, by blood, by inheritance. And in that silence, unanswered questions hovered still. Did he know her? Did he see her? Did he claim her as his own? The unanswered questions lingered in the silence, suspended like dust motes drifting in the air above her bed, neither settling nor dispersing. And into that silence came the weight of confession. For Ada, sensing that the hours of her life were narrowing, turned at last to her mother with words she had long held back. Annabella had always been her stern guardian, her keeper of reason, the hand that shielded her from the dangers of imagination and the shadow of Byron. Yet now, as pain hollowed her body and the end drew near, Ada's voice softened into truth. She confessed first of her debts. With trembling lips, she revealed to her mother the full extent of the wagers, the schemes, the secrecy that had surrounded her. It was not simply sums of money, but the shame of concealment, the weight of deception that pressed upon her conscience. Annabella listened in grave silence, her face tight, her eyes shadowed. There was reproach in her gaze, yet also sorrow, for she understood that her daughter's brilliance and her recklessness were twined as inseparably as vine and trellis. Ada wept as she spoke, not for the money lost, but for the trust strained, the love tested. She asked forgiveness, though she seemed uncertain whether she deserved it. Her confessions did not end there. She spoke, too, of her passions, of whispers of affairs, of longings that had carried her beyond the boundaries of propriety. Whether these were truth or only rumor, magnified in her fevered mind, no one could be certain. But to Ada, they were burdens that must be laid down before death. She confessed them haltingly, as though fearing judgment, yet compelled by the urgency of her failing breath. Her mother's lips pressed tightly, her hands clenched in her lap, but she did not withdraw. She listened, stern even in compassion, and when Ada faltered into sobs, Annabella placed her hand upon her daughter's and whispered that God's mercy was greater than human error. These confessions seemed to ease Ada, though they drained what little strength remained in her. She lay back against her pillows, eyes closed, whispering that she felt lighter, as though some chain had been loosened. Yet there was one final request, one that mattered to her above all, that she be buried beside her father in Hucknall. Annabella stiffened at the words, for to her, Byron remained not only a memory, but a wound. She had built her life upon resisting his influence, shielding Ada from his legacy. Yet now her daughter sought in death to be joined to him. Ada's voice, though faint, was resolute. She spoke of her life as a mingling of two inheritances, her father's imagination and her mother's discipline, her father's flame and her mother's restraint. To deny either was to deny herself. She wished, she said, to lie beside him not in rebellion but in reconciliation, to acknowledge the truth of her being. "It is where I belong," she whispered, "for I have been his and yours, both, always." Annabella closed her eyes, torn between resistance and pity. At length she nodded, though her voice was heavy with reluctance, and in that nod, Ada found her final peace. The chamber in those days was heavy with the presence of clergy, summoned at Annabella's insistence. Ministers came, praying over her, urging repentance, urging faith. Ada received them with courtesy, but her thoughts moved in their own patterns. She confessed, yes, and she prayed, but her words were often laced with reflections upon numbers, upon patterns, upon the laws of the universe. To her, faith and mathematics were not opposites, but different dialects of the same divine language. She told one minister that she felt herself close to the great central truths of existence, though she did not say whether those truths were scripture or science. Perhaps to her they were both. Her body weakened further. She could scarcely sit, scarcely eat, scarcely lift her hand. Yet her eyes, though sunken, retained their peculiar fire. Visitors remarked upon it, the strange brilliance that seemed to endure even as her flesh failed. She spoke less often of debts, less often of scandal, and more often of destiny. She said that her notes would outlast her, that one day the world would know them, though not now. She seemed at times less a dying woman than a prophetess, whispering into a future that only she could see. In the long nights the candle burned low beside her bed, the flame bending and straightening with each draught of air. She would watch it with half-closed eyes, as though seeing in its flicker the reflection of her own life, steady, trembling, uncertain, yet still burning. She whispered once to her attendant that she felt her life had been like that flame, consumed quickly, unevenly, sometimes bright, sometimes faint, but always restless, always reaching upward. The nights were marked by the tolling of distant church bells, their sound muffled yet insistent, carrying through the silence of her chamber. Ada listened to them with strange intensity, saying that each toll seemed to measure not the hour but the span of her remaining time. She asked once what bell would toll for her, and whether it would sound in triumph or in sorrow. No one answered, for what answer could there be? The question itself was left hanging in the air, like the fading vibration of the bell itself. And as the bells tolled, as the candle sputtered, as the ministers prayed and her mother watched, Ada lay between confession and reconciliation, between faith and calculation, between her father and her mother, her life and her death. She had asked for what mattered to her most, forgiveness, understanding, and her place beside Byron, and in these she found her last fragments of peace. The candle flame fluttered, bending low, and its shadow fell across the wall like the swinging of a pendulum. The toll of a church bell drifted faintly through the night air, long and unresolved, carrying into the silence of the chamber. The faint tolling of the church bell lingered in the air, each vibration fading into the stillness of the room as the candle's flame bent and straightened, like the swing of a pendulum. From that slow rhythm, Ada's world narrowed further until it was reduced to whispers, fragments of memory and the dim glow of light upon scattered notes. Her chamber, once filled with books and conversation, had become a vigil. The curtains were drawn, the windows closed against autumn's chill, and only those nearest to her, her mother, her attendants, a physician or two, remained to witness the contraction of her days. Upon the table near her bed lay papers, some unfinished, some forgotten, their ink already fading. Pages of calculation mingled with fragments of confession, with letters begun but never sent, with half-formed thoughts that would never be resolved. To the eyes of her attendants, they were no more than the clutter of a restless mind. To Ada, they were the last testament of a life lived too quickly, burning through visions faster than the world could receive them. She tried at times to reach for them, to gesture that they be brought closer, but her strength failed, and the papers remained where they were, silent witnesses to her decline. Her voice, when it came, was now a whisper, and often those around her leaned close to hear. She spoke sometimes of her father, sometimes of her children, sometimes of the debts she feared would tarnish their future. At other times, she spoke of engines again, describing with faint urgency the movement of gears, the weaving of symbols, the possibility of patterns too vast for human hands to calculate. Her attendants nodded gently, humoring her, yet within her whisper there was still the echo of prophecy. Even in dying, her mind clung to the same horizon it had always pursued, the marriage of imagination and number, of poetry and machine. Her mother pressed her toward Scripture, toward final repentance, and Ada complied with a strange mixture of obedience and detachment. She repeated prayers, received comfort from ministers, listened to passages of the Bible read aloud. Yet her eyes often wandered past them, staring into the flame of the candle or into some distance invisible to others. Perhaps she prayed and calculated in the same breath. Perhaps she saw in both the same great mystery. Those near her could not tell, nor could she explain, for her strength no longer allowed for long speech. The pain, dulled by morphine, returned in waves that left her gasping. Her attendants cooled her brow, adjusted her pillows, whispered reassurances that scarcely reached her. Between the waves, she found moments of stillness, and in those moments she seemed almost serene, as if already half removed from her body. She would look around the room as though seeing not only what was there, but also what was absent. Her father, her visions, her unfinished work. Her gaze would settle on the shadows along the wall, shifting with the candlelight, and she would watch them intently, as if expecting them to take shape and speak. It was during one such interval that she whispered to her mother, "All is unfinished." Annabella, startled, asked what she meant. Ada did not answer, or perhaps could not. But the words hung in the chamber with a weight greater than explanation. They might have referred to her notes, to the analytical engine, to the debts, to the fragments of her life scattered across the table. Or perhaps they referred simply to life itself, always ending before the vision is fulfilled, always leaving more unwoven than woven. Her children were brought to her bedside once more. She reached for their hands with trembling fingers, her eyes shining with both sorrow and tenderness. She told them to be brave, to guard their spirits, to live not too cautiously but not too recklessly either. Her words came slowly, haltingly, yet with the authority of one who had lived both extremes. They listened, though their young faces revealed confusion as much as understanding. To them she was still their mother, not yet the figure of legend or scandal she would become. Her words, though incompletely grasped, would remain in their memory, carried forward as fragments of her voice. The hours of night and day blurred together. The candlelight seemed to merge with the dim daylight that filtered weakly through heavy curtains, until time itself felt indistinct. Attendants marked the hours by the tolling of bells in distant churches, by the physician's visits, by the gradual dwindling of her strength. For Ada, the measure was simpler. The length of each breath, the weight of each pain, the distance between visions. On her bedside table, a single candle burned, its wax nearly spent. The flames sputtered, bent, straightened again, casting shadows that swayed upon the walls. In those shadows, Ada seemed to see her life reflected. The wings she had once sketched as a child, the figures of Euclid drawn in youth, The brass gears of Babbage's engine, the shuffle of cards at the gambling tables, the silhouettes of her children, the absent face of her father, all these flickered and dissolved as the shadows swayed, unresolved, unfinished. As midnight passed into the early hours, the whispers in her chamber grew fewer. Her attendants dozed in chairs, the doctor left for the night. Her mother remained vigilant at her side. Ada lay motionless, her breaths shallow, her eyes half-closed, yet still glinting faintly in the candlelight. The silence was broken only by the soft creak of the house settling into night and the faint hiss of the candle as wax dripped down its stem. The flame quivered, leaning toward extinction, then steadied once more, as though reluctant to depart. And in its fragile persistence, Ada lingered too, suspended between life and the silence that pressed upon her. The flame persisted, trembling upon the edge of extinction, and Ada lingered with it, each breath a fragile resistance against the silence pressing close. The chamber was hushed but heavy with expectation, as though even the air itself waited. Her mother held her hand, her attendants leaned near, the physician spoke in whispers that carried the finality of resignation, and when at last the flame bent low and fell into darkness, her breath too faltered, caught, and stilled. Thus, on the 27th of November in the year 1852, at only 36 years of age, Ada Lovelace passed from this world, leaving behind fragments of vision, shadows of scandal, and the echo of a mind that had burned too brightly for its span. The house was filled at once with the muted stirrings of ritual. Curtains were drawn tighter, mirrors covered, voices hushed, further still. Servants moved softly as though fearing to disturb the stillness that now lay upon her body. Her children wept, bewildered in their youth, scarcely able to grasp the magnitude of absence. Her mother sat rigid, stern even in grief, her gaze fixed upon her daughter's face with an expression more of severity than tenderness, as though still guarding her against some final danger. Death, however, admits no guardianship. In the days that followed, arrangements were made in accordance with Ada's request. She was to be buried beside her father, Lord Byron, in Hucknall Torkard Church in Nottinghamshire. It was a decision that stirred murmurs in society. Some found it fitting, the union of father and daughter in the same earth, two figures bound by brilliance and scandal alike. Others found it troubling, even scandalous, that a countess of standing should rest beside a man still notorious for his excesses and infamies. Yet Ada had spoken firmly in life of this wish, and so it was honored. The journey of her body to Hucknall carried with it an air of both reconciliation and irony, for she, who had scarcely known her father, was in death placed at his side, joined at last in silence. The churchyard was damp with autumn rain, the stones slick beneath the boots of mourners. The sound of the service echoed within the church, solemn and restrained, the words of Scripture mingling with the faint drip of water from the eaves. When her coffin was lowered into the ground, it settled beside Byron's, and the soil that covered them seemed to close not only over their bodies, but over the unfinished story of their bloodline. Society, ever watchful, did not remain silent in its judgment. In salons and drawing rooms, in quiet letters and whispered conversations, her name was weighed again. Some spoke of her as a cautionary tale, the daughter of Byron undone by the same reckless fire, her brilliance squandered in gambling, her life shortened by excess. Others spoke of her as a tragedy, a mind of rare genius unrecognized, her notes forgotten, her vision ignored, her promise cut short by illness. A few, a very few, spoke of her with awe, remembering her insight into Babbage's machines, acknowledging that she had glimpsed something the rest of them had not. Yet theirs was the minority voice, and the tide of her century carried her swiftly into obscurity. Babbage himself mourned her. Though their relationship had grown strained in later years, he recognized her death as the loss of one who had understood him as few others had. In his journals and letters, his grief is evident, though it is mingled with his own preoccupation with engines and calculations. He spoke of her as a profound interpreter, a mind rare in its union of logic and imagination. Yet his own reputation was faltering, and his words carried little weight in shaping how others remembered her. Her mother, stern even in mourning, sought to preserve Ada's reputation through silence. She discouraged talk of the debts, the scandals, the gambling. She presented her daughter instead as pious in her final hours, reconciled, penitent, prepared for death. Perhaps it was true, perhaps only the version of truth Annabella could bear. Either way, the Ada who lay in Hucknall was no longer hers to manage. The earth received her without condition, without judgment, without revision. And so, in the quiet of the Nottinghamshire churchyard, Ada Lovelace lay beside her father. Above them, the English sky shifted with gray clouds and scattered rain. The stones bore their names, carved into permanence, yet the lives beneath were restless, even in memory. Father and daughter, bound in life by absence and in death by soil, both became figures whispered of more than studied, remembered more for scandal than for substance, at least for a time. As the mourners departed, their footsteps softened into silence, leaving only the sound of rain upon stone. The coffins lay in darkness, the church bell tolled once more, and the world beyond continued its indifferent turn. Ada's visions, her notes, her unfinished equations, her debts, her confessions, all were folded now into earth and time. Yet even in that burial there lingered questions. Was she a caution or a prophet? Was she undone by her passions or exalted by her genius? Did she die in scandal or in triumph unrecognized? The answers were left unresolved as the shadows that had once flickered across her chamber walls. The rain fell more steadily, soft upon stone, soft upon soil, soft upon the two coffins lying side by side. And in that sound of falling rain, one might almost hear footsteps retreating into history, leaving behind only the faint echo of gears unturned, of wings unbuilt, of notes unwritten. The rain's rhythm lingered, steady and unresolved, as though it were itself a question left unanswered. The rhythm of the rain lingered on stone, soft and unresolved, as though each drop were a muted question falling into silence. And silence indeed followed Ada's passing, a long hush that settled not only over her chamber, but over the memory of her life itself. The world moved on with scarcely a pause, and what she had written, what she had dreamed, was left to gather dust upon shelves, unremarked, unread. It was as if death had not only claimed her body, but had drawn a veil across her name, consigning her to obscurity even as the earth at Hucknall closed above her. Babbage alone kept her memory alive for a time, though even his voice was muffled by the weariness of his own decline. He felt her absence keenly, for she had been one of the very few who understood not only his designs, but the spirit behind them. In his journals and in letters to friends, he spoke of her brilliance, of her singular combination of imagination and reason. He mourned her as a friend, as a collaborator, perhaps even as the interpreter of his life's work in ways he himself could not achieve. Yet Babbage was himself embattled, regarded by many as an eccentric, whose projects had consumed too much money and yielded too little. His admiration of Ada carried little power in shaping how society remembered her. In the drawing rooms of London, her name faded. Where once there had been gossip of her gambling, of her debts, of her brilliance and her scandal, there was now only silence. A few remembered her as Byron's daughter, a curiosity in her own right, but fewer still remembered her notes, her visions, her mathematical labors. Her children grew, carrying with them fragments of her memory, yet they too were absorbed into the wider fabric of their world. Ada had lived in paradox, both brilliant and reckless, both admired and condemned, and in death, her paradox resolved itself into absence. The manuscripts she left behind, her translation of Menabrea, her extensive notes, her letters, lay largely untouched. They were stored, forgotten, regarded as curiosities rather than treasures. No one in her age could see in them what she had seen. To them, the Analytical Engine was a failed dream, an unfinished machine, and her commentary was but an ornament to Babbage's eccentricities. The century pressed on with its own engines, locomotives, factories, machines of iron and steam, but none yet conceived of machines that could think, that could weave patterns of logic. The seed she had sown fell into earth unready to receive it, and so it slept, dormant, awaiting another time. The long silence that followed her death was not unique, for history has often treated women thus. Their voices dimmed, their visions overlooked, their names remembered, if at all, only in relation to men. Ada was remembered chiefly as Byron's daughter, a footnote in the story of a poet, rather than as a voice who had glimpsed a future beyond her century. Babbage raged, wrote, argued, but his engines remained incomplete, and so too did Ada's memory. Without the machine, her notes seemed to many a fantasy, and so the silence stretched across decades as her coffin rested undisturbed in Hucknall beside the father she had never known. Yet within that silence, the manuscripts endured. They waited quietly, words pressed into paper, ideas folded like seeds. They were not destroyed, not lost, but merely overlooked, like a book unopened on a dusty shelf. And in that waiting, they preserved their power. One wonders if Ada, in her final hours, sensed this, that though her contemporaries would not hear her, some distant age might. She had spoken often of the future, of patterns that extended beyond her own time. Perhaps in some corner of her mind, she knew she was writing not for her world, but for another. Babbage grew old, his engines never built, his name half forgotten. He died in 1871, still dreaming of the machines that would not come to life in his day. With his passing, Ada's memory faded further still, as though the last tether to her work had been cut. The 19th century closed its ledger upon them both, recording them as eccentric curiosities, footnotes in the story of science, their true significance unseen. And yet the manuscripts endured. They lay in quiet archives, in libraries, in private collections, until another century came, a century that began to build machines not of brass, but of electricity. Machines that process not only numbers, but patterns of logic. In that new age, scholars opened Ada's notes and read with astonishment what she had written. They saw that she had not merely translated Menabrea, not merely commented upon Babbage, but had envisioned the very idea of programming, of machines that could weave symbols, compose music, simulate thought. What her own century had dismissed as fanciful, the 20th century recognized as prophecy. But that recognition was still far away, still sleeping within the silence that followed her death. For now, in the years after 1852, her legacy was a quiet one, scarcely whispered, scarcely remembered. Her children grew, her mother lived on, her debts were settled, her scandal faded. The world marched forward into railways and telegraphs, wars and empires, without pausing to remember the frail countess who had dreamed of engines of thought. In the churchyard at Hucknall, the seasons turned. Rain fell upon the stones, snow lay upon the graves, spring brought blossoms to the grass. Visitors came to see Byron's resting place, to honor the poet, or to gawk at the scandal of his life. Few, if any, paused to notice the grave beside him, the daughter who had asked to lie there, the woman who had lived and died in the shadow of his name. Yet she was there, her body resting in silence, her words resting in archives, her vision resting in obscurity, all waiting. And in that waiting, one might hear not only silence but a faint echo, like the sound of pages turning in a closed library or the murmur of an engine not yet built. The silence was not an ending, but an interval. The rain that fell upon the stones grew lighter, shifting into mist. The mist lingered, neither lifting nor settling, as though it too were waiting. The mist lingered over the stones, holding to the churchyard as though reluctant to lift, softening the outlines of graves until names and dates blurred into anonymity. For many decades, Ada's name too remained blurred, half forgotten, bound chiefly to the scandal of her father or the eccentricities of Babbage. But silence is never final, and in time, silence gave way to rediscovery. As the 19th century yielded to the 20th, the world began to build machines that bore faint resemblance to what Ada had imagined, not engines of brass and cogs, but devices of wires, switches, and circuits. In that new light, her notes, long dormant in archives, were opened again, and readers saw in them something astonishing. They read her words on the Analytical Engine and realized that she had described not merely arithmetic, but programmability, the capacity for a machine to follow symbolic instructions. They saw in her notes the first algorithm ever written for a machine, an instruction for calculating Bernoulli numbers, and they recognized her as the first to conceive of what would later be called software. What had seemed fanciful in 1843 now appeared prophetic, the seed of a new age. Thus Ada Lovelace, once dismissed as Byron's troubled daughter, was reborn as the prophet of the computer age, the first programmer, the woman who had seen the future through the flickering light of her candle. Her legacy, however, was not remembered without ambiguity. Some scholars argued over how much was truly hers, how much belonged to Babbage, how much was imagination rather than practical engineering. Yet even in these debates her significance grew, for it became clear that she had spoken a language her century could not yet understand. Where Babbage had thought chiefly of calculation, Ada had thought of symbols, of patterns, of music and art. She had seen beyond the machine's mechanics into its philosophy, its potential to alter the very nature of thought. In this, she was singular, and even her critics could not deny it. The world that rediscovered her was itself grappling with machines of new power. The early computers of the 20th century, vast rooms filled with circuits and humming with electricity, bore no resemblance in a form to Babbage's engine, yet in principle, they carried forward the same dream. And in those humming rooms, Ada's name began to appear again. Her notes cited as the first articulation of what these machines might one day achieve. She had written of engines composing music, and now machines processed sound. She had written of weaving symbols, and now machines process language. She had written of patterns too vast for human hands, and now machines calculated with speed beyond imagination. Her visions, once dismissed, now appeared as the outlines of reality. In this new recognition, she became more than a figure of scandal. She became a symbol. For women in science, she was an ancestor, proof that intellect and imagination were not bound by gender, though her own age had sought to confine them. For mathematicians, she was a voice that spoke of their discipline as beauty, as poetry, as creation. For computer scientists, she was the first among them, the one who had seen that the machine was not merely a calculator, but a new kind of mind. Yet even as her fame grew, the ambiguities of her life remained. The debts, the gambling, the whispers of affairs, the frailty of health, the severity of her mother. All these continued to haunt her story. Some chose to ignore them, to polish her into an icon of genius untainted. Others emphasized them, painting her as a warning of brilliance undone by excess. But perhaps her truth lies not in one or the other, but in the coexistence of both. She was at once visionary and reckless, prophet and scandal, flame and shadow. To separate them is to lose the paradox that made her who she was. At Hucknall, her grave remained beside her father's, the two names carved in stone, the two lives bound in silence. Visitors continued to come chiefly for Byron, the poet whose scandals and verses had shaken Europe. Yet some, reading more deeply, came also for Ada, pausing at her stone, reflecting on the strange arc of her life. In time, her grave became a place not only of curiosity, but of homage, where pilgrims of science and imagination alike might stand and remember the woman who had glimpsed the future. Her story, like her notes, continues to raise questions. Did she foresee us? Did she imagine machines not only weaving numbers, but shaping the very world in which we now live? Did she see, in some flicker of her vision, the glowing screens, the humming processors, the invisible networks of logic and code that define our century? We cannot know. She spoke of patterns, of music, of possibility, and left the rest to time. The mist lifts slowly from the stones, revealing once more the outlines of names carved in granite. Ada's name, once obscured, now stands clear, illuminated not by candlelight, but by the recognition of a future she could scarcely have believed would come so quickly. She remains both cautionary tale and legend, both scandal and prophet, a woman whose brief life contained contradictions as intricate as the equations she loved. And as the mist rises, the silence deepens again, carrying her story into memory. We leave her where she wished to be, beside her father, bound by both absence and presence, her life unfinished, yet enduring. The rain has ceased, the stones glisten, and the air is still. In that stillness her voice lingers, faint as a whisper, reminding us that even in frailty, even in scandal, even in death, imagination may cast a light that reaches centuries ahead. The candle is gone, the flame extinguished, yet in the quiet one might still hear the faint turning of unseen gears, the echo of patterns unfolding, the soft pulse of a future she dreamed but did not live to see.